The commentator starts the great wrestling tournament that is held every 10 years and had reached its expected final match, asking if finally any human could triumph for the first time in 150 years. Peter Grill was standing in front of his fighter, who was a minotaur, while thinking that if he won the fight, he would be able to have something with Louvelia, to then launch into combat against the minotaur, clashing their weapons. After a while of fighting, Peter manages to remove a horn to the minotaur to then win the battle, and the commentator gives the announcement of the new champion and representative of the Yakupachi Guild, Peter Grill. All the spectators celebrate the victory of Peter. Peter would leave to go quickly to a part to then meet a girl named Mimi Alpacas, who tells him if he can ask him a favor. Peter asks him what was the favor, and Mimi explains that, now as he was the strongest man in the world, he wanted some of his. Peter, hearing this, ends up falling, and Peter, annoyed, asks him what he was saying, and Mimi explains that ogres is important to have strong children. Peter, when hearing this, claims saying that it was not the same for humans, and Mimi remembers that the human and ogre world was very different. Mimi doesn't have a better idea than asking Peter that they should have, but it only makes Peter more upset, saying that he didn't understand what she said. At that moment, Mimi's sister named Lisa arrives to stop her. Peter asks Lisa to stop her sister, and Lisa tells Mimi to behave herself. Peter asks Lisa to stop her sister, and Lisa tells Mimi to behave, because Peter's seed was going to be for her. Peter is only disappointed to hear this. Then Lisa explains to Peter that his seed was the most important in the world, because he was the champion. Then Lisa and Mimi surround Peter to give him his seed. Peter, being cornered, distracts them, making them look elsewhere, and then escapes quickly to the church. And when he arrives, he meets Louvelia, who is happy of his arrival. Peter tells Louvelia that he had made it, and Louvelia answers him that yes, and although her father was stubborn, he finally ends up giving him the approval so that the two of them can get married and have children. Peter, upon hearing this, asks Louvelia how babies are made, and Louvelia laughs upon hearing what Peter said, saying that sometimes she thought he was joking. Louvelia explains to Peter that the babies came from the stork when the parents love each other too much. Peter, upon hearing this, cries from happiness, thinking that Louvelia was someone too innocent, thinking that he started his relationship with Louvelia 2 years ago. But as his father was overprotective and guildmaster, they have barely managed to hold hands. After a while in the night, Peter had finished taking a bath and was about to lay down to go to sleep. And when he takes off the sheets, he finds Mimi in the bed. Peter is scared, and Mimi insinuates Peter to do it with her. But Peter kicks Mimi out, thinking that ogres have no decency. And just when he sits on the bed, Lisa tells Peter that finally they were alone. Peter, when seeing her, also kicks her out of her room and tells them to leave. But the girls start to make a scandal, causing everyone in the inn to come out to see what was happening, and criticizing Peter for taking 2 naked girls out of his room. Peter ends up letting Lisa and Mimi in to stand against the wall, while he told himself to keep calm, so he doesn't fall in their trap. Peter makes it clear to the 2 girls that he was engaged to Louvelia. Then Lisa explains him that they were aware of his relationship with Louvelia, and that they had just held hands, but that the 2 girls could give him more fun than Louvelia. Peter refuses, saying that cheating on her would be something unforgivable, but Lisa takes off her clothes, putting Peter's hand on his chest, and then blowing in his ear, making Peter to be carried away by his instincts. The next day in the morning, Peter wakes up disconcerted, thinking about what had happened, while Lisa and Mimi were sleeping next to him. At that moment, Peter throws a scream to the air, blaming himself of how he could have been so weak while he was crying, and just in that moment someone knocks on the door, who was Louvelia herself, asking if she could come in. Peter, hearing Louvelia's voice, grabs Lisa and Mimi by force and puts her in the closet, telling them to keep quiet. Peter opens the door and Louvelia asks him why he was so sweaty, and Peter deceives her, saying that he was training, making Louvelia happy, saying that she was glad that he was keeping his regime instead of being blinded by his achievements, and for some reason she chose him as her future husband. In that, Louvelia explains that he came to visit him was to tell him that when they returned to the guild, had planned to announce to his father about her engagement to him, and asked if he was going to be there. Peter, to hear this, excited that of course he would be there, as he only has eyes for her, in that Peter remembers the reason why he participated in the tournament. And the reason was, for Louvelia was his wife, and only needed to have the blessing of his father, finally have his happy ending with Louvelia. Later that day, Peter goes to the head of the guild to get his approval to be with Louvelia. But Albatross, Louvelia's father, replies with a no. Louvelia, hearing this, claims to her father that he himself said he wanted the champion to be his son-in-law. But Albatross tries to attack Peter, screaming for cajoling his daughter, but is stopped by one of his servants before he ends up killing Peter. Louvelia has no choice but to get in front of her father to threaten him that if he does not accept her relationship with Peter, she herself will cut all ties with him to leave the house. Albatross, hearing this, calms down and accepts that he has no choice but to give him his blessing, and then look with hatred at Peter. The servant realizes and gives the announcement that Peter and Louvelia were going to marry, ordering to prepare a feast and a tournament in his honor. Peter and Louvelia watch the party from a rooftop, so Peter tells Louvelia that he is surprised that he was able to face his father. Louvelia tells Peter that she was nervous, but maybe her love for him gave her the strength to face her father. Peter is happy for Louvelia's words, but then he remembers what he did with the ogre girls, saying that the guilt was killing him. After a while, Peter was sitting at a table alone, thinking that if they find out what he did with the ogre sisters, the guild leader was going to kill him. And then the ogre sisters appear by surprise, and Lisa tells him that the two of them were ready to support him in his marriage. And Peter thinks that finally the two of them came to their senses. But Mimi proposes Peter to have a quickie right there. And Peter asks the two of them if they didn't hear the news and that his engagement with Louvelia was official. But Lisa answers him that it wasn't from Louvelia, but Lisa answers him that it was none of his business, and that they only wanted to have a son of the strongest warrior in the world. At that moment, Mimi pulls down Peter's pants, making him get scared, and Lisa approaches him and threatens him, saying that if he doesn't deliver his seed every time they say it, they will tell everyone his secret. At that moment, Peter hears Louvelia's steps and realizes that he didn't have time to put on his pants, and he has no choice but to hide the ogre sisters under the table and cover half of his torso with the tablecloth of the table. Louvelia arrives and sits at the table and tells Peter that her father had another one of his outbursts. So Peter laughingly tells her that she was the only one who can calm him down when he gets out of control. And just then, Albatross appears, giving Peter the order to give him the chair to sit with his daughter. Peter is shocked and thinks about what to do, since he had no pants, and if he got up, they were going to see the ogre sisters. Albatross, seeing that Peter did not answer, repeats the same order. But Peter has no choice but to say no. Albatross gets upset and asks Peter if he was refusing a direct order. Then Peter replies that he was not going to move away from Louvelia and that he considers it a proof of love for her. Albatross gets more upset, and when he was going to grab Peter's arm, Louvelia stops him and remembers the threat that Louvelia gave him. If he did not accept his relationship with Peter, then upset, he decides to leave. Louvelia thanks Peter for having confronted her father, and that she was more and more convinced that he was going to be a worthy husband. Peter was happy to hear these words. Louvelia asks him if something was wrong, but she is interrupted by one of her father's tantrums, and Louvelia has no other choice but to leave to calm him down. At that moment, the ogre sisters leave the table, and Lisa tells Peter if they can continue where they left off. Peter tells them that he was not going to fall in the same stone twice. At that, Lisa tells him that if his little friend did not agree, and Peter argues, saying that it was only a physiological response, and that it has nothing to do with it. At that moment, the ogre sisters get on top of Peter, and he tells them that they are going to check how much he can stand it. The next day, Peter was observing the landscape while thinking about how he tripped in the same stone again, asking why everything was more evident after he messed up. Peter was having a dream where Louvelia was on top of him, while Louvelia tells him that she already knows where the babies come from, being Albatross, making Peter get scared and launching a loud scream, to then wake up and see an elf on top of him. Tim was hearing noise in Peter's and goes to see what he was doing, and when he turns on the lights, He sees Peter on top of an elf, and Tim tells him he didn't see anything, and was going to take the secret to his grave, and then get out of there. The elf thinks he is going to have to do it the old-fashioned way. And the elf introduces himself as Vegan Eldoriel, and came as an ambassador to the land of the elves, on behalf of his brothers. Peter, upon hearing this, feels she has a bad feeling and wonders if she came with the same crazy ideas as the Ogre sisters. Then Vegan tells him that the reason for her visit was so she could take the nectar from his parts. Hearing this, asks sure why it had to be him. And Vegan explains that his race have always been weak in tournaments, being even humiliated on several occasions. And the chief of his people was looking for seeds of strong species in order to make his species stronger, and she's ambassador was there to take his nectar, and then show her tender side and tell him that he can do whatever he wants with his body. Peter wonders why the semi-humans always ignored his point of view completely, and that they only thought about reproducing. Peter tells Vegan that he is flattered that beautiful girls want to be with him. But unfortunately, he has to reject the proposal. Vegan, to hear this, is offended and asks him how he can reject a proposal from a noble elf, and that if he did not agree, by good he was going to squeeze him even if he does not want it. At that, Peter tells him that it was impossible, showing that his intimate part was asleep. Vegan, seeing this, feels offended, because he thinks that his body is not able to excite Peter, and yells at him, because he does not have an erection. And Peter seriously replies that as long as his heart has owner, he would never be carried away by his carnal desires. Vegan gets upset and tells him that he had no choice, and then gets up and invokes a spell to cast it on Peter's private parts. Vegan explains that he cast a curse spell of forbidden magic, saying that tomorrow night he will appear in front of her, and she will have to beg him on her knees and then escape through the window. Peter looks at his private parts, but he doesn't notice any change and thinks that he has never known any spell for the private parts and that he probably just wanted to scare him. So he prepares himself to start with today's hunt. Luvelia was with a group of soldiers looking for a creature that appears in the dusk, and that one of the soldiers warns Luvelia that it was getting dark and that it can be dangerous before finding the lair of the monster. And the best thing was to wait for the combat unit, in that the guard looks at the floor and tells Luvelia to see it, realizing that there was a giant footprint. Just then a giant monster appears, where Luvelia was giving a big scream. Returning with Peter, a girl informs Peter that a beast has just ambushed Luvelia and shows him a picture of the beast, telling him that it was attacking villages, devouring men, and outraging women. Peter, hearing this, goes running quickly to where Luvelia was to save her. Luvelia was badly wounded, together with the only soldier left alive. The soldier tells Luvelia to escape, while he was acting as a human shield, but Luvelia decides to attack the monster. But the monster breaks Luvelia's sword and then grabs her with one of its tentacles. Monster completely subdues Luvelia and was about to introduce its tentacles in her private parts, and Luvelia begins to ask Peter for help. A sword begins to cut quickly the tentacles that subdued Luvelia, and Luvelia looks up and realizes that it was Peter. Peter takes Luvelia to safety and shouts at the monster. How could he think of hurting Luvelia? And then he begins to attack the monster, cutting his arm and then stabbing his sword in the monster's head. Everyone present is surprised by Luvelia's abilities, while in the distance were the Ogre sisters, who were more surprised. And Lisa says that was the reason why she needed to have Peter's genes in her lineage. And Mimi mentions that it was a good idea to join the guild, where he was when they heard the rumors. Peter lifts Luvelia and asks her if she was okay too, which Luvelia answers yes, and then thanks him for saving her, and that this confirmed that if it wasn't for him today, she would have been lost. At that, all the soldiers start to shout Peter's name, while Peter thought that all this was uncomfortable. At night in the bathroom, Peter was taking a quiet bath, thinking that Luvelia did not suffer any kind of serious damage, and also won a reward from the people who lived nearby. But at that, Peter gets up seriously and wonders why he still had adrenaline to spare. At that, he wonders if it had something to do with the spell of the elf. And just Vegan appears, saying that he hit the nail on the head and tells him that he did not notice bigger than the last time. Vegan asks him if he had already begun to regret having rejected her, and Peter asks him if the he had was because of the curse that she put on his private parts. Vegan answers yes, since it was a curse forbidden through the generations. That was the eternal and whoever receives the curse was going to have an insatiable excitement in his private parts. But if he didn't do anything about it, he was going to start damaging part of his tissue, making him impotent forever. Peter, upon hearing this, is frightened. Vegan mentions that it would be miserable to have the virility of an old man being so young at that. Peter begs Vegan to do something, and Vegan tells him that the only way to break the curse was for Peter's seed to stay inside Vegan, and that his only option was to give him his seed. Peter yells that he can't do that, and Louvelia was the only one for him at that. Louvelia calls Peter, who was in the other part of the hot springs, and tells him that if he had heard the legend of the site, Peter asks him what she means. And Louvelia tells him that the village was famous for the hot springs, but that the spring water was special, and according to rumors, those who dive in the water will be blessed with a son. Then Louvelia asks Peter if he wanted to test if that rumor was true. Peter, upon hearing this, is shocked and does not know if what he says was true or a dream, remembering that the only intimate contact he has had with Louvelia has been holding hands with her, thinking it was an opportunity to progress. But in that, he remembers his problem with his intimate part, in that Peter has no choice but to tell her that he did not feel it was the right time, and Louvelia tells him that he does not understand. Vegan mocks him, saying that it was a wise decision, and why not start begging him, asking if he didn't need something from her. In that moment, Peter, crying, kneels in front of Vegan, begging her. In that moment, Vegan starts to take off his towel, and Peter says in his head that he is doing it for his future with Louvelia. Vegan tells him to end this farce once and for all, saying that he can come whenever he wants. In that, Peter approaches Vegan while repeating in his head that this was not infidelity. The next day, Peter wakes up in his room together with Vegan, being in shock. In that, Vegan wakes up and tells Peter that he is not doing wrong. But Peter does not listen to her. Albatross was crying on his throne while screaming because he felt he was losing his daughter. At that, one of his servants approached him, saying that he had received a missive forward. Albatross, when he finished reading, begins to laugh, and then said that Peter Grill was finished. The next day, Peter met with Albatross, who explained that they had received a marriage proposal from the orcs. At that, one of the servants of Louvelia's father puts it more in context, explaining that Babe, one of the aristocrats of the orcs, had submitted a proposal to see his performance in the tournament. At that, Peter claims them, saying that Louvelia and he was already engaged at that. Just arrives Louvelia, who asks his father what all this meant, claiming that the guild already recognized his commitment to Peter. And what was that proposal? At that, Louvelia's father tells him to calm down, and that it was just a formality. The servant tells them that the nobility of the orcs was one of his biggest customers of the guild, and as they considered their economic contribution, would be foolish not to take advantage of the offer. At that, Peter tries to give his point of view. But Louvelia's father asks him if he was afraid of getting attached to another woman, despite being faithful to Louvelia. At that, Louvelia tells her father that she already knows what he was trying to do, but that he was just wasting his time, since the simple idea of Peter defrauding her trust was ridiculous. At that, Peter remembers everything he did with the girls, thinking that it hurts his heart. Peter and Albatross meet with Babe, who tells them they have been very generous for accepting his request, so out of the ordinary, and that he was grateful. Albatross mentions to him that great minds think alike, while Peter thinks that everything that was going on must be a trap, but that the guild master was ignoring something important, which was that looks were not the only thing that mattered, to then turn to see a female orc and be disgusted by what she looked like. At that, Babe asks his soldier to go find Piglet. But Peter was calm, as the beauty status of each species was different between humans and orcs. But at that, Piglet enters, and Peter is impressed by Piglet's beauty. Peter and Piglet were walking down the street together, and Peter thinks that Albatross saw his face and thinks that Piglet is just going to desire his seed. At that, Piglet starts to sweat, and Peter asks her what was wrong, and Piglet tells him that she had never talked to a man before. Peter and Piglet start talking, and Piglet tells Peter that she was just a servant of Babe, and suddenly she was involved in a marriage. Peter asks her if she was interested, and Piglet says that she was just following Babe's orders. but she had kept in her memory the fight she had in the tournament. Piglet, about to cry, says that it was disgusting that someone like her was offered to someone of high status like Peter. Peter asks her how it was disgusting, and Piglet explains that she has suffered constant mockery from the orcs, and then runs away from there. In that moment, Piglet collides with some bullies who start to bother her, but in that moment, Peter arrives and hits the bullies, and then leaves with Piglet from there, while explaining that for the humans, she was someone pretty. Peter and Piglet meets with Albatross and Babe. Peter complains to them, saying that the marriage was only for something political, and that he was not taking into consideration the feelings of those involved. And when he was about to leave, Babe tells him that they just need to get to know each other a little more. Then put Peter and Piglet in a room where the two were going to sleep together. Albatross's servant named Goodman tells Albatross that Piglet had taken the aphrodisiac, and Albatross says that it will be the end of Peter the moment he has something intimate with the orca, causing his engagement to Luvelia to fall apart, and then cut off his head. Goodman, in his head, apologizes to Peter, saying that the guild were short of money and to do it for the good of the guild. Peter tries to concentrate and asks Piglet to calm down, and then reveals to her that he was already engaged. But Piglet tells him that she doesn't care. Peter explains to Piglet that it was all a trap of the guild and the nobility of the orcs in that. Piglet stops, and Peter thinks that he already understood. But Piglet starts to cry, saying that she was not pretty and not good enough for him either. Peter stops her and tells her that for him, in his opinion, as a human, she was pretty. Piglet, on hearing this, gives Peter a kiss. Peter gets alert, as he knows that this was what the guild wanted, and tries to calm down. But at that, Piglet starts to show more of her body, making Peter can't take it anymore. The next day, Peter wonders why she did it and how she had lost because of a pair of boots. At that, Peter gets scared, as he was completely screwed. As if Piglet told what happened, they were going to cut his head off, being completely scared. At that, Piglet wakes up and tells Peter that they can now tell Babe that they can be together. But Peter stops her, saying that she must not tell anyone what happened that night. Piglet, almost crying, asks him why. So Peter asks her if she thinks it's okay to continue being a puppet, explaining that their marriage was just something political, and then asks her what was her heart's desire. Piglet, on hearing this, tells him that he should think about it. Being reunited. Babe says that they hoped that they had been able to consolidate a relationship. In that, Albatross asks Piglet if something had happened last night, and Piglet says that Peter was firm all night and never laid a finger on him. Albatross and Babe are surprised to hear this. Then Piglet asks them a favor, explaining that although there was no physical contact, cannot deny that they had connected and wanted to improve more their relationship with Peter, asking permission to go to the guild and be next to Peter. Being outside, Piglet talks to Peter, saying that she made that decision was to avoid that. Orcalandia cannot get her, and when she is pregnant with Peter, she will train her son to become a strong warrior and destroy the orcs that made her suffer so much. Peter thinks she had created a terrifying monster. Then Piglet tells him that she will do her best to be by his side to get pregnant with him. And although it does not seem so, she was a fertile orca, and it will be a pleasure to be by Peter's side. Piglet had prepared the food for Peter. Peter thanks her. Then Lisa asks Peter if he had slept with an orc, and then she asks him what an insufferable elf was doing in the room. Vegan tells Lisa that Peter's seed was going to belong to the elves, making the ogre sisters upset and wanting to start a fight against Vegan. But Peter stops them, saying not to fight for him. A strong light comes out of the window of Peter's inn to show that Vegan had been easily defeated by the ogre sisters, who mock her for being too weak. Lisa explains that without the magic of the elves, they were pathetic creatures. And Vegan, being on the floor, shouts that she was a damn barbarian. Peter approaches and claims to Mimi and Lisa that attacking someone defenseless was not right, to then raise his hand to Vegan, who sees the gesture and lets herself be lifted by Peter. Peter asks Vegan if it was okay, and Vegan answers yes. At that moment, Mimi claims them, saying that they had seen Peter first, and Lisa answers that they have priority. But Vegan mocks, saying that those words don't mean anything, and tells the sisters that they were just brutes that surely took advantage of their instincts to get what they wanted. At that moment, Lisa asks who was the orca, Then Piglet introduces herself to the girls and explains that she was Peter's personal assistant. Piglet starts to say that she understands how the situation is with the four of them in the same place. Since they were all looking for Peter's ancestry, Vegan laughs and says that she chose Peter as her husband, and then insults Piglet by saying that she was just a dumb orc who thought she could beat a noble elf like her. And it just makes her look ridiculous. Piglet explains to Vega that she never intended to hog Peter, and that she doesn't mind if any of her Isra is Peter's mistress. All the girls are impressed by the answer Piglet gave, and Vegan thinks about how she had such a permissive posture at that. Vegan notices Piglet's and feels that Piglet is making fun of her breasts, and then tries to attack her, but is quickly stopped by Peter. Vegan yells at her that Piglet made fun of her breasts, and Peter tries to calm Vegan down by saying that she had not made fun of anyone. At that moment, the sisters tell Vegan that she was paranoid, and Lisa makes clear the hierarchy between them, saying that they were going to compete with their feminine charms. Vegan thinks it's perfect, and Piglet also joins to compete. Peter is shocked when he hears this and wishes that someone stops this madness. Vegan invokes an agape, explaining that she was a fairy able to measure male arousal. Peter asks them to please no more spell, but Vegan ignores him and makes a summary of the rules, saying that the winner will be the one who gets Peter more aroused. They all agree, and in that moment, Mimi and Lisa take off their clothes to bump their in front of Peter, getting a score of 91 points. Vegan gets scared when she sees the score and goes quickly to look for something to wear, putting on a small swimsuit. But she barely manages to get 3 points. Vegan gets upset with Peter yelling at him because he didn't have erections with her at that. Piglet says that it was her turn, but Peter sees Piglet's outfit getting 91 points. While Vegan on the floor yells because Piglet had such big boobs, while the sisters say she was formidable. Vegan, annoyed, tells the girls that boobs are forbidden, and the ogre sisters make fun of Vegan for not having. All Peter was thinking when this ordeal was going to end. At that, Tim appears in the room, and Peter asks him for help on how to stop this problem. And Tim, being drunk, tells him that if he wants to stop a conflict, that he will just use this, showing the bottle of alcohol he was carrying in his hand. At that, Tim invites the girls to drink, making them calm down and having a little party, where they end up eating and drinking too much. Peter thinks that Tim's plan worked because it helped to lighten the atmosphere. But for some reason, he had a bad feeling. At that moment, Lisa approaches Peter saying that he should drink more. And Piglet approaches him with the same intentions, filling her jug completely with alcohol. At that moment, Peter stood up and shouted to them to stop, because he knew that they only wanted to get him drunk to do what they wanted with him. And then he gave a speech saying that Luvelia and him were united by destiny, and that he was not going to fall in temptation again. In that moment, the girls approach Peter's hoeing their breasts, and the excitement meter would got to the limit. And then Lisa kisses Peter, telling him that he had a lot of time and alcohol to have a good time, that he tries to wake up Vegan, telling her that last night nothing had happened. And Vegan answers him that Peter last night looked like a beast, showing how it had left the agape completely destroyed by his excitement levels. In that, all the girls wake up and starts to make some rules, so the same thing that happened today will not happen again, making a pact about Peter Grill's reproductive resources. Peter tries to get the girls' attention, but they were all hell-bent on creating the rules for Peter's private parts. Mimi yells that magic should be banned at that. Vegan tells Mimi that her violent treats should be banned. Mimi gets upset and tells Vegan that it was to stimulate her flow. Piglet mentions that the program had a huge problem. Lisa tells Piglet that she was very observant and that she was more than a pair of walking boobs. At that, Lisa tells the girls that they should go over the agreement and write a final draft. At that, they all agree, while Peter tried to get their attention, but is completely ignored. The terms of the interspecies pact came into effect immediately, making Peter to carry out rigorous daily duties, so that finally the day of rest, stipulated in the pact, would arrive. Tim asks Peter why he was in a good mood, and Peter tells him that according to the pact, today is a day of rest. And finally, he will be able to enjoy his freedom with Luvelia. Tim grabs his shoulder, saying that he understood his situation, and that he hasn't been out for a long time, and that he should have fun. Peter was waiting for Louvelia, and when Louvelia arrives, she tells him that she hoped she didn't keep him waiting so long, showing her white dress. Peter is surprised by Louvelia's dress, and Louvelia asks him if something was wrong, and Peter replies that he was captivated by her beauty. Peter and Louvelia shake hands, and Louvelia tells him that with flattery he was not going to get anything, and then they go to spend some couple time. After a while, Peter thinks about the peace that being with Louvelia gives him, and then they both go to a restaurant for the night. Louvelia mentions that the food was exquisite, and Peter tells her that if she liked it for him, it was fine, and mentions that the guild was crazy about the place where they were. Louvelia apologizes to Peter for dragging him to do his shopping, but Peter replies that there was no problem since he had a good time. In that, Peter and Louvelia celebrate their future, and Louvelia looks at the scar that Peter had on his hand, saying that he had done something horrible, since by his carelessness he had marked the hand of the strongest man in the world. Peter mentions to her that for him it was a badge of honor, and that was the reason why he could be with her. And then the two of them hold hands. Louvelia asks him if he hated her before, and Peter answers her not to be mean. Peter, in his thoughts, wishes that this moment was forever. But he is just interrupted by Mimi, who was behind him, telling him that it was a coincidence to be there. Peter gets scared and wonders what Mimi was doing there at that. Mimi approaches him and asks him if he was on a date, but Peter asks her in a low voice what she wanted, since he was on his day off. At that, Mimi tells him what she was saying, since it was the perfect opportunity to go ahead and keep his seed. Peter, upon hearing this, grabs Mimi by the horns and claims to her that the agreement was made to respect each other. Louvelia tells Peter that he had become very close to the ogre, and Peter replies that yes, since he was helping her to train, but he still didn't get the rhythm of the training. At that, Peter asks him for a moment to take Mimi away from that place. Peter takes Mimi to the bathroom and tells her to give him a break, since he was on an important date. Peter thinks that if he can't get her out of there soon, he will end up ruining the little time he can spend with Louvelia. After a while, Peter comes out of the bathroom, thinking that he had committed another act of high treason. At that moment, Peter quickly fixes his hair to hurry so as not to raise suspicions. But when he arrives at the table, he finds Vegan, who was next to Louvelia. Vegan tells him that she was satisfied with something quick and simple. At that, Peter thinks what happened with his day off. Louvelia tells Peter that it seems that he has made very good friends with that elf. And Peter answers that destiny has a twisted mood, and then he takes Vegan to the bathroom. After a while, Peter finishes with Vegan, getting her to leave, and he hurries to be with Louvelia. But Louvelia was drinking wine with Lisa. Peter thinks that it was useless and that nobody had thought to follow the rules. And then he takes Lisa to the bathroom. Louvelia was remembering the moments that she spent with Peter when they were young, and all the missions and problems that they had together. Louvelia and Peter were walking back on the street, and Louvelia tells Peter that she had a fantastic evening. Peter apologizes that they ruined the date, and Louvelia tells him that it's not a problem. Peter laughs at what Louvelia said, and at that moment, Louvelia tells him that she was going home, since her father could make a scandal if he came back late. Peter tells her that it was true that the guild master was too restless. Louvelia replied that it would be nice to go on a trip without the guild being involved, being alone in a quiet place, and Peter said he agreed. At that, Louvelia proceeded to leave, and Peter thought if he should stop her. He tried to stop her, but his emotions and the guilt of having had other girls eat him up inside, making him stop in his tracks, thinking that if this continued, sooner or later, he would not be able to tolerate the torture of being unfaithful to Louvelia. Peter was in the bathroom while having memories of the past, and that Piglet enters the bathroom, and Peter turns around asking what he was doing there, and realizes that Piglet was in towel, making him get a scare. Piglet tells him that he had finished preparing dinner. Peter asks Piglet if she knows that today was a rest day, and Piglet answers that of course she knows. Peter is relieved to hear this, and Piglet tells Peter that if he wanted, he could wash her back, and Peter accepts. Piglet asks Peter if something was wrong, and Peter says that he was the biggest scum in the world, since today had to be a special date with Louvelia. but he ended up doing all sorts of despicable things behind her back, and then started to cry. Piglet tells Peter that it breaks her heart, so Piglet puts her hands on Peter's cheeks, and Peter starts to cry, and Piglet says that surely it must have been horrible. Piglet tells him that he can be calm. Unlike the others, she was not going to make him suffer, and that if he wants, he can unburden himself with her. Piglet lifts her arm, making his towel fall off, saying that she accepted him as he was with his defects. Peter, seeing Piglet's, ends up getting excited and ends up having sex with her. After finishing, Peter wonders what the pact was for. In that, Lisa says that they had there and that it was a flagrant violation of the pact. In that, Vegan comes out of the water saying that it can be expected from a farm animal. And Mimi also comes out of the water mentioning that she had to be watched. In that, Mimi and Vegan try to catch Peter, but Piglet gets in the way, saying that with all due respect, they had invaded Peter's privacy in broad daylight, and that they have no right to criticize her. Peter says that they all ignore the pact, and that they were also denying any responsibility, blaming the others. At that, the girls say that given the circumstance, they were going to share their fluids equally. Finished having, Peter jumps into the water to start hitting the water multiple times, while wondering why the same thing was happening to him, and yells at him, saying that if he knows what it is to have a day off, asking what had happened with the pact, and that at this point, it was just a piece of paper. Vegan tells Peter that he might be right, and Lisa mentions that it was a problem, and Mimi explains to Peter that the pact does not specify any kind of punishment for those who break the rules. Peter, when hearing this, says that they hadn't reached the point of no return. At that moment, Peter has an attack and runs out of the bathroom and then ends up in the middle of the street, naked. Peter thinks that the best thing to do was to run away and go to a faraway place, thinking that the best thing to do was to get out of there, and then ends up falling to the ground. Peter gets up and shouts to the four winds that he says goodbye to Luvelia. And that day, Peter Grill, the strongest man in the world, had stripped himself of everything and fled. But nevertheless, even in his sadness and his mental fragility, Peter was unable to abandon the life he had forged. Peter says that he cannot throw it all away, and that he cannot tolerate leaving behind his relationship with Luvelia. At that, a giant ogre sits next to Peter, saying that the rain had chosen a bad time to fall. At that, the ogre pulls out a handkerchief and tells Peter that if he wishes, he can use it. Peter grabs the handkerchief and thanks him. The ogre comments that as far as he could see, Peter had gone through a terrible tragedy, and Peter tells him that it was a shameful story. The ogre tells him that he can listen to him if he wishes. Peter explains that he had made a terrible mistake several times, and that at this point, if he wished, he could abandon everything. But that no matter what happened, he could not stop thinking about Luvelia. The ogre, upon hearing this, tells Peter that love was out of our control, and that he understands what he feels, and it may be fate. But he was there because of the woman who stole his heart. The ogre tells Peter that 3 years ago, he had traveled the whole world to find her, and when he had finally found a clue, he learned that she had joined the Warriors Guild of this same city. And although he does not know the details of his situation, he tells him that he should not give in to fear, and that if his love was true, then he was sure that the gods would light his way. Peter is touched by the ogre's words, thinking that he had too much compassion and kindness for a stranger, and that he can't believe there is such an ogre. Peter thanks him, and tells the ogre that he was not going to give up, and that no matter what happened, he was going to have his happy ending with Luvelia. At that, it had stopped raining, and the ogre tells him that the best thing was for him to leave. Peter tells the ogre before he left that it was a coincidence that he was in the Warriors Guild, and asks the ogre what was the name of his beloved. The ogre tells Peter that she was the best warrior and royal princess of Ogrostan, and that she was coming to look for Miss Lisa Alpacas. Peter is in shock and wonders in his head if Lisa was really a princess. Lisa was watching the window while she was enjoying the landscape, but at that moment she is interrupted by Peter, who tells her to explain herself. Lisa asks her what he means, and Peter asks her if it was true that she was a member of the royal family, but Lisa doesn't answer him. But Peter takes it as a yes. Peter tells how a few months ago, out of nowhere, 2 warriors arrived to the guild, and that he was a member of the royal family, and Peter asks him to please answer her. Lisa asks Peter who told her such a thing, and Peter yells at her not to answer him with a question, since he had asked her first. Lisa ends up agreeing, and that she didn't see the point in denying it. And Lisa affirms that everything he said was true. Then Lisa shouts, saying that she recognizes her position as the heir princess of Ogrestan, making Peter be in shock. In another part, the ogre that had talked to Peter was at the reception of the guild and introduces himself to the receptionist as Antonio Spartacus. Antonio was about to ask something to the receptionist, but she was in love with Antonio, and in that moment, Mimi arrives and asks the receptionist if she had any job. In that moment, Antonio recognizes Mimi, and Mimi realizes Antonio's presence and tells him that she almost doesn't recognize him. Going back to Peter and Lisa, Peter claims to Lisa that if she got pregnant, it could unleash an intentional disaster. And Lisa answers him that he was worrying in vain and that she guarantees him that her identity would not put him in any risk, because the only thing she wanted was his seed. And when she conceived a child of the strongest one, she would disappear from his sight forever. And after that, she would never reveal the name of the father. At that moment, Lisa takes off her clothes and approaches Peter to tell him that the best thing to do was to get to work to increase the probabilities. At that moment, Antonio had arrived in front of the inn. Since according to Mimi, that's where Lisa was, Antonio enters the inn and stands in front of the door of Lisa's room, thinking that it had been a long trip, remembering how Mimi and Lisa had disappeared 3 years ago, leaving a note in which they said that they were going to polish their skills. But nevertheless, his feelings towards Lisa haven't weakened in all this time, that he was looking for her. So Antonio opens the door entering the room. At that he hears Lisa's voice, in the other door that was in the room, and Antonio starts to say that the heart of the great Spartacus still belongs to Lisa. At that, Antonio opens the door shouting Lisa's name, finding that Lisa was having sex with Peter. Antonio, when witnessing the scene, throws a tremendous kick to the floor that causes that the whole place starts to break, and yells to Peter what he was doing to Lisa to proceed to attack Peter. Antonio throws a tremendous blow that makes Peter to go out of the inn and causing a big hole in the wall. Peter, when seeing the damage caused, yells that they were not going to give him back the security deposit. Antonio tells him to keep his excuses and then continue attacking Peter. Peter grabs a banana and uses it as a sword to stop Antonio's big axe. Peter thinks that even if he could prevent all his movements, the banana was not going to resist too much. And when Antonio was about to attack Peter again, Lisa shouts Antonio, telling him to stop, saying that it was an order from Lisa Alpacas, Crown Princess of Ogrestan, telling Antonio to stop his senseless violence at that precise moment. Antonio reluctantly stops, while Peter is surprised by the amount of hate that Antonio was giving off. Peter, Lisa, Mimi, and Antonio meet in Peter's destroyed room. Then Peter asks the ogre sisters if Antonio was an old friend of theirs, and Mimi says that Lisa has liked him since they were little, and, since then, he hasn't stopped pursuing her. Antonio tells Lisa that she had become a very beautiful woman, and Lisa asks Antonio what was the reason to come from so far away. At that, Antonio lowers his head and asks Lisa to end his mission and to return to the nation, and that it wasn't only him, but the whole army was missing their leader, and that at this step, even the most loyal soldiers of Ogrestan. But Lisa interrupts what Antonio was about to say and asks him to raise his head, saying that the suffering of the soldiers hurts him even in his soul, but that he still can't afford to return. Antonio asks him what was the reason, and Lisa explains that the 3 years of adventure led her to these lands and also to Peter, having chosen Peter as the strongest in the world to donate his seed to him. Lisa tells Antonio that her job was to create more powerful generations than the previous ones. And as the future leader of Ogrestan, it was of utmost importance to her, and that she was not going to return until she was pregnant with the strongest man in the world. Antonio, when hearing this, hits the floor and tells Lisa that since his youth he had admired her, and since then he had trained tirelessly to become worthy of her affection. And Lisa tells him that the reason was simple, and that an ogre like him was much weaker than her, making Antonio's heart break. And Peter says that she was ruthless, and Lisa continues explaining that this was the root of her problem, because if there was a man worthy of her in Ogristan, she would never have undertaken her journey, and that if she really cared as much as she said, she should prove her worth as a parent. Antonio, upon hearing this, says that he was just as he says, and that the Spartacus of the past was an incompetent, incapable of overcoming her strength, but nevertheless he had passed to be worthy of her affection. Had gone through a long training of 3 years without rest, and that he appears before her to demonstrate his refined skill in combat. Antonio says that it was time to demonstrate the fruits of his effort. Then Antonio shouts the name of Peter to then point to Peter, saying that with the honor of accompanying Lisa at stake, he challenged him to a duel. Peter was in the battlefield, while all the spectators were saying that they had challenged Peter for a woman. Peter thinks that even if he wins the fight, everything will remain the same. But in that moment, the idea occurs to him that if he ends up losing the fight, Antonio could leave for Lisa to his country, and it would be one less obstacle in his relationship with Louvelia. Peter, when thinking about this, the only thing he has to do is to let himself win in the match. While Peter was thinking about his plan to let him win, Lisa approaches Peter and points to him, telling him to watch. Peter turns his head and realizes that Louvelia was watching the fight, while next to Louvelia was Mimi. And Lisa tells Peter that she suggests him not to try anything crazy like losing on purpose because she wants to keep their agreement a secret. Peter is in shock and says that it was as if he could read his mind at that. Lisa tells the fighters to step forward. Then Pete and Antonio stand in front of each other. Lisa starts to say that in the name of the Warriors Guild and the army of Ogrostan, she expects both of them to give their best in defending their honor. Lisa asks the two of them if they were ready, and they both say yes. Then Peter and Antonio start the fight. At that moment, Antonio tells Peter if he remembers the conversation they had when they met. Antonio tells him that it was ridiculous to talk about the virtues of love in front of a man that only knows about lies and deceit, and that he shouldn't even waste his time in a duel, and that it would be enough to tell the whole world how crude and treacherous Peter's behavior was. But nevertheless, because of his ogre pride, he would never forgive such an act of cowardice. At that, Antonio gets into a stance that astonishes Tim, and a soldier asks Tim if he already knows that stance, and Tim replies that it was the two tomahawks stance, Egan style, and that it was a terrifying technique of Ogrostan's army, since it is said that nothing can survive the crushing weight of their vortex twists. Antony tells Peter that as an advocate of true love, the very idea of being defeated by a heartless like him was ridiculous, and that Antony Spartacus has adored Lisa since he was a little boy, and had honed all his skills to be considered a whole man, and had also maintained his purity. At that, the spectators are surprised that Antonio is still a virgin with his body, and they start to tell Peter to lose. And Peter in his head doesn't know how much he wants to lose. Peter thinks that he has never wanted to lose so much in his life, but he can't do anything else. Antonio rises to attack Peter, giving a tremendous jump while he was preparing his destructive spinning punch. At that moment, Antonio throws a strong punch to Peter. Then Peter closes his eyes and defeats Antonio with a punch, asking for Peter's forgiveness. At that moment, the spectators start to throw trash to Peter for not letting him win. And Lisa says that the winner was already decided. At that moment, Antonio recovers his consciousness and tells Lisa that it wasn't what it seems. And Lisa asks him what happened, saying that Peter was obviously stronger than him, and she doesn't care about weaklings. Antonio, when listening to Lisa, makes her very sad, and Peter tells Lisa to have a little compassion for him, because Antonio came from far away just to look for her. She wouldn't be so bad with him. Antonio kneels down and asks Lisa for another chance. Lisa, seeing that Antonio was begging, tells him that she was thinking to give him another opportunity to show his strength, and that the next fight was going to be against her. Lisa tells him that they were going to fight next week, because if they fight with his current state, surely it was going to be a complete failure. And then she leaves the place. At that moment, Peter tries to leave silently, but Antonio stops him and kneels in front of Peter, saying that with his most sincere apologies, he apologized for all the offenses against him. And now he knew the truth about the strength of the champion of the great tournament. And Antonio tells Peter that being frank when he lived in Ogrestan, he could never beat Lisa in combat, and that he begs him to be his apprentice. Peter, when hearing this, tells him that it was a bummer, but Antonio keeps begging him, saying that his duel against Lisa was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and he can't let the victory escape him. And he implored him, since he needed his help. At that, Vegan tells Antonio that his prayers were heard. And Vegan tells Peter that he suggests him to give Antonio what he wished. And Piglet agreed with Vegan. Peter asks him what they mean, and Vegan explains to him that by joining forces to train the ogre, they were going to be able to guarantee their victory in the duel, making Lisa have to go to her country together with Antonio. Peter realizes that they were right, and although he can't defend himself directly, he can launch an attack indirectly with Antonio, and this way manage to demonstrate Antonio's strength to Lisa. Peter tells the girls that he was right, and that they are going to try it, making Antonio very happy. And Peter warns him that the lessons were going to be too hard, and if he was ready, Antonio with energy shouts yes to Peter starting the training program, where Peter puts Antonio to do all kinds of training, taking him to his limit, thanks to Peter, who was the strongest instructor in the world. And Vegan also helps Antonio to improve his musculature, thanks to forbidden elven black magic, and Piglet's fortifying recipes. After the training, Peter notices that the receptionist named Michi was being too nice to Antonio. And Peter asks Piglet what she was doing there. And Piglet explains that lately, she has been bringing lunches to Antonio, and that she was beginning to suspect that Michi liked Antonio. The day of the duel had begun, and Lisa tells Antonio that it seems that this time he came well-trained, and Antonio replies that today was going to be the day where the great Spartacus was going to prove his worth as a man. Peter was with his arms crossed, thinking that the day had arrived, and he encourages Antonio to show Lisa what he was capable of and to go for the victory. At that moment, Mimi starts the fight, making Antonio and Lisa to go to the attack, having an even axe fight. Peter thinks that with the training that they gave to Antonio, the two of them should be even. At that, Peter realizes that Lisa was laughing and realizes that Antonio was moving slower, and Peter realizes that Lisa was using her breath to distract Antonio. And Peter realizes that the reason why Antonio can't defeat Lisa was because of her falling on her knees. Vegan and Piglet ask Peter what happened, and Peter answers them, saying that the fight was over. At that moment, Lisa starts to attack Antonio, who doesn't defend himself, winning the fight. Vegan protests, saying that it was a trap, because Antonio was a virgin, and that it wasn't fair that she was shaking her udders to distract him. In that moment, Mimi defends Lisa from the critics, saying not to insult the ogres with her silly accusations. Peter in his head tells Antonio that the reason of his defeat was because of leading such a disciplinary life that led him to his perdition, and it seems that a man can't resist to destiny. Antonio wakes up in the infirmary asking where he was, and Peter tells him that he was sorry, making Antonio depressed. Peter thinks that even if he gives him a rematch, the result was going to end up being the same, but that it was not the fault of his skill. At that, someone knocks on the door, and Peter tells him to come in. Then Michi opens the door asking if Antonio had woken up. Peter had found the solution for Antonio and the missing piece, which was that Antonio should feel comfortable with women. Antonio asks Antonio for a few moments alone and asks Antonio what he thought about Michi. But Antonio answers that he doesn't understand the question, and Peter tells him that here, between the two of them, Michi was known for her fanaticism for muscular men, and with a body like his, it wouldn't take anything to conquer her. Antonio asks Peter what he was trying to say, and Peter tells him that he was going to be direct, telling him that he can't beat Lisa, since she was very susceptible to the charms of the opposite sex. Antonio is surprised with Peter's revelation. Peter explains to him that his celibacy on Lisa's behalf had put him in disadvantage, since he couldn't stop eating her with his eyes and he can't concentrate in the fight, and that's why he needed to get more familiar with women. Antonio gets upset and yells at Peter what he was trying to say, and if he wanted him to give his virginity to another woman, then Lisa. At that moment, Peter asks Antonio if when he was with Michi, he didn't feel butterflies in his stomach, Antonio answers that he had dedicated his whole life to Lisa, and Peter tells him that that was not the healthy way to think, because he was missing a lot of experiences, since he was only focusing too much on one woman, and that was the cause of his weakness. At that moment, Michi interrupts the conversation, and Michi tells him that he knew very well how much he cared about Lisa, but in the same way what he felt for him was equally or even stronger. Antonio, when hearing this, is completely crushed by Michi, and Peter leaves and tells Antonio that he had nothing more to show him. A few days later, Antonio mentions that he felt that he took a huge weight off his shoulders, and Peter tells him that he did, and that now he was a new man, and he wasn't the same of yesterday. And now with that power running in his veins, he should be able to defeat Lisa. And Peter tells him to ask for a rematch, but in that moment, Antonio tells him that he admits everything that he had said, because by dedicating all his life to only one woman, he had lost sight of the way to true happiness. At that moment, Michi arrives and delivers the lunch to Antonio, and Antonio tells Peter that Lisa was a thing of the past, and Peter thinks that Antonio was a bastard for giving up when he got a girlfriend. At that moment, Lisa says that finally Antonio had found someone suitable for him, saying that in spite of being so sentimental, he was the best of his army, and that she hoped that with all this he will dissipate his doubts and end up triumphing as a good leader and soldier. Lisa thanks Peter for helping him at that moment. Lisa asks Peter if he has ever thought about what true happiness means for him. Lisa thanks him for helping him, and Lisa asks him if he has ever thought about what true happiness means for him. At that, Lisa approaches Peter and asks him if it was marrying the naive and innocent Louvelia and having the violent and senile Albatross as a father-in-law, telling him to be sincere. And if he calls that happiness, Peter doesn't know how to answer, and Lisa tells him that if he was serious with his relationship, he could easily be the king of a nation, and that he should think about it. And then Lisa leaves the place. Peter doubts which was his true happiness. And at that moment, Louvelia arrives, making Peter have a smile, and then he says that he was never going to doubt again, and he had decided that this was going to be his way to happiness. At that, Louvelia grabs Peter's hands, saying that there were goblins, and that an invasion is coming. At that, he goes on horseback with Louvelia to defeat the goblins. And Louvelia tells him that there are several villages that have requested his help. Peter says that if they do not end this at the root sooner or later, a catastrophe would be unleashed. In that, Peter begins to remember the moments he spent with Louvelia and tells him that he would protect her. And whatever happens, he would keep her safe. And Louvelia tells him that it was the same and trusted him. Peter tells him that at the end of the mission, the two would leave alone. And Louvelia says she already wants to start the journey.